In this video we're going to look at how the starter dependencies work. So Spring Boot's based on starter dependencies, this concept of having dependencies which can bootstrap and pull in certain technology facets, and it works pretty much by exploiting the dependency resolution mechanism and transitive dependencies, which is common in the two main build frameworks today, which is Apache Maven and Gradle, and also Ivy as well, which is another dependency management system. Although it's much less used, that's actually used internal inside Gradle itself. So to understand what happens, let's jump into Chrome and let's go to start.spring.io. This is the Spring Initializer website that we've seen before. And what we're going to do is if we just go, we're not going to add any dependencies for now. We can add extra dependencies if we want to. We're not going to do that for now, so I press escape there. We're just going to explore the existing project. And this is a Maven project we'll see. So we're going to explain the starter dependencies in terms of Maven. So if we just hit explore, then we'll see that the first file it takes us to is the pom.xml file. And this is the build file for Maven, the standard build file, which defines the project object model. That's basically a representation of the project, which details how the project should be built in terms of dependencies, which need to be pulled in, plugins which need to be executed, properties the build might use, that kind of thing. So yeah, in the root of the project, we have this pom.xml file. So if we look inside here, if we look into the dependencies section, we can see that out of the box, if we exclude the test scopes dependencies and just look at the production ones, which are ones which don't have a scope, where the default scope is going to be compile, which means the dependency will end up in the production application on both the compile class path and the runtime class path, and therefore bundled in the jar file or in the war file in the webinflib directory. If we just focus our attention on this particular dependency here, we can see we've got a group ID of org.springframework.boot and an artifact ID of spring boot starter. So armed with that knowledge, if we take this group ID, just take that and do Command C to copy it. And then we're going to leap over to search.maven.org, where we can get more information about the dependencies available in the Maven central repository, which is where all dependencies are pulled from, regardless of whether projects are built with Maven or Gradle or Ivy or whatever. They're always pulled from the Maven central repository. So if we just put into this search bar here, org.springframework.boot, and then colon, and then we go back to Spring Initializer, and we're just going to take this artifact ID here. Again, Command C to copy, go back into here, and just after the colon, Command V to paste. So now we can see we have this particular Spring Boot module, or dependency, if you like, highlighted. And what we're looking at here is the main dependency in any Spring Boot project. So any Spring Boot project, regardless of whether it's a web app using Spring MVC, or if it's a command line application, maybe doing some court scheduling, or if it's some kind of connector which you've developed, which is again probably run from the command line or from a batch job, which is like doing some kind of publishing of messages or consuming from a queue, whatever it might be, regardless of the actual technology types which are used in the Spring Boot application itself, this dependency will always be present. And this is an absolutely critical, without exception, number one dependency that all Spring Boot projects need. And without it, in fact, you don't have a Spring Boot project. So very important, so let's take a look at it now. So we can see here we have the latest version of 2.3.1.release. So we click on here, and this then takes us to the Pom file for this dependency itself. So whereas before we saw the Pom file for the sample project, or the project that's going to be generated from this Spring Initializer website here, in other words, our Spring Boot application that we're about to develop, or that we would be about to develop rather, instead of seeing that dependency, what we're seeing here is actually the project object model of this dependency here. So how Maven works, when we include this dependency, it doesn't just bring in one jar file called Spring Boot Starter. Instead, it downloads the Pom file for this Spring Boot Starter. So it downloads this file here, effectively, and then it goes through and it grabs all of the dependencies which are declared in this file too. So it's going to grab this Spring Boot Starter you can see here. It's going to grab Spring Boot Test. It's going to be grabbing Spring Boot Test Auto Configure and all these other ones. And similarly as well, we could keep going. So if we copy this into another tab, and if we copy this to here, so now we're looking at the first dependency which Spring Boot itself, or rather which the Spring Boot Starter dependency will bring in. Go into here, oops, I missed out an S there. Then you see that it too also has a Pom file. And it too also brings in some dependencies. So this one's bringing in org.springframework.boot Spring Boot, and Spring Boot auto configure, and Spring Boot starter logging. Now it may well be that there's some overlap between what different dependencies bring in, and that's okay. They won't be brought in twice. What happens is Maven or Gradle will make a unified, consolidated view of the full graph of dependencies and pull them all in as separate jar files. And it does that by effectively recursing through, in other words, visiting each dependency, pulling its Pom file, getting its dependencies, for each dependency there, pulling its Pom file, getting its dependencies, and so on until there are no more dependencies to be resolved. It works out that full dependency set, and then the complete set of jar files, which that corresponds to, it'll download those into your either local Maven repo cache or your local Gradle cache, and include those jar files in the class path of the project. And then you'll see those in your IDE. You'll see them included in your WAR file if you're a web app and you're building a WAR file. You'll see them in the command launch to use the JVM if you're running the Spring Boot application from, for example, inside IntelliJ IDEA. Those are the places where you'll see these particular class paths.